Hans' treasure box. English summary story. Once there lived a man named Hans, who didn't have any money, home, or food. But despite that, he remained happy. He decided to take a walk towards the next town, hoping to find something. Soon, an elderly woman called out to him. She offered him a magical blue coat and gave him instructions. She told Hans to climb a tall tree, go inside it, find 3 doors, and follow her guidance in each room. In the first room, there was a dog sitting on a box with big eyes. Hans wasn't scared and followed the old woman's instructions to find money in the box. The same happened in the second and third rooms, where he found gold and jewels. Excited by his discoveries, Hans filled his hat with money and gold and put jewels in his shoes. But the old woman asked for a small favor in return: to retrieve a glass box from the third room. Hans followed her request, collected the box, and made his way back. Hans found the glass box next to the dog and struggled to climb back up the tree with all the heavy gold and jewels. He managed to make it out but refused to throw down the box when the old woman demanded it. Suddenly, a stone hit him, but he held on and didn't fall. When the old woman asked if he threw it, he refused to give her the box. She got angry, and despite her name calling, Hans walked away. Arriving in town at night, he found a nice room and asked for the best food. The next day, he bought beautiful clothes and soon became a wealthy and respected man, gaining many friends. One day, someone mentioned the princess, who was confined to a big house by the king's orders. The man explained she couldn't leave because the king feared she'd marry a poor man as predicted by a wise old man. Curious, Hans asked why she lived that way and learned about the king's protective measures. Hans wanted to see the princess but was turned away from her house by the king's servants. Determined, he dressed in his finest clothes and went to the king's home, but the king threatened him and warned him to stay away. Living lavishly, Hans soon ran out of money. He moved to a poor house and became poor himself. His rich friends stopped inviting him over, and he struggled to find the tree with the 3 dogs. Eventually, he had no money even for food. Desperate, he noticed the small glass box in his room and thought of selling it for bread. Curious about its contents, he tried to open it without success. When he hit it, a dog with eyes as large as eggs appeared and brought him money. Realizing a pattern, he summoned the other dogs with more hits on the box and regained wealth. He bought beautiful clothes again, moved to a big house, and his friends returned, questioning his absence. However, Hans felt disconnected from them, consumed by thoughts of the lonely princess trapped inside her house. Unable to walk in the garden or talk to anyone other than the servants and the old king. The princess lived an unhappy life, secluded and restricted within the walls of her house. One night, Hans couldn't sleep and had an idea. He summoned the dog using the glass box and brought the sleeping princess to his garden, hoping to give her a taste of freedom. The princess woke up in the garden, confused and afraid at first, but soon marveled at being outside with the sky above her and the ground beneath her feet. She was amazed by the absence of walls and windows, experiencing the sounds of the night around her. As they walked, the sun began to rise, and the princess realized she had to return. Hans explained how he brought her there using the glass box and the dogs. Grateful for the night, the princess asked the dog to take her back, wanting to avoid being seen. The next day, the princess couldn't recall the events clearly, but she felt different. Her jealous and unkind servant woke her, reminding her of her duties and the waiting king. Uncertain, the princess inquired about the king's summons. The princess happily leapt out of bed, exclaiming about the beautiful day to her servant, Anna. Anna began to notice oddities. The princess woke up much later than usual, was unusually cheerful, her nightdress was soiled, and a strange white flower lay on the floor, a flower not found in the king's garden. Anna reported these peculiarities to the king, who decided to observe the princess and wait for her next outing. Meanwhile, Hans was deeply smitten with the princess and couldn't resist seeing her again. He called the dog with the glass box and asked for the princess's presence in his garden. The dog carried the princess while Anna stealthily followed. They stopped at a big house where the dog entered, and Anna marked the door with an X before returning home. In the garden, Hans shared stories about his past and his family with the princess, who enjoyed his tales. In turn, she spoke of her father's drastic change after her mother's death. He secluded her, showing no interest in ruling but obsessing over white flowers in his garden. The princess reminisced about her mother's love for white flowers, noting that her father's flowers now constantly wilted. As dawn approached, she bid Hans good night and he summoned the second dog with the glass box, the one with eyes as big as oranges. This perceptive dog spotted the X mark on a door nearby and alerted Hans. Excited, Hans planned to mark more doors with X's in the surrounding streets. The following day, Anna narrated the night's events to the king, leading them to Hans's street. Confusion arose about which house had the X, eventually revealing every house in the area marked with an X. Enraged, the king returned home. Later, Anna devised a new plan involving white stones to track the princess's movements. That night, using the glass box, Hans brought the princess to the garden while the dog with eyes as large as plates waited by the house. In their conversation, Hans expressed his desire to be a prince, and the princess confessed her wish not to be a princess. Meanwhile, Anna secretly placed white stones in the princess's clothing, intending to use them to track her movements outside the house. The princess expressed her desire not to marry a prince, preferring to be a simple girl. Meanwhile, the perceptive dog spotted the king and Anna with a large group of servants approaching, following the trail of the white stones Anna had strategically placed. Sensing danger, the dog warned the princess about the king's arrival. It quickly carried her away through the streets, while the king, Anna, and the servants reached Hans's house, searching for the princess. The king, in a mix of anger and shock, found his daughter's shoe next to beautiful white flowers and was momentarily speechless. Then, he furiously threatened Hans, declaring that his woodcutter would behead him at noon the next day. Hans found himself locked in a room in the king's house without his glass box. But he remembered where he had left it, under a tree in the garden. As dawn broke, he spotted a young boy below and made a deal, asking the boy to fetch the box from his garden in exchange for 3 pence. The boy returned with the box, and Hans managed to retrieve it and toss down the promised payment before the king's men interrupted. Subsequently, Hans was taken to the town square where a woodcutter prepared to execute him on the king's orders. Just as the woodcutter asked if Hans was ready, Hans used the glass box to summon the 3 dogs. With the help of the dogs, he commanded them to take the woodcutter away and dismiss the king's men. Then, Hans ordered the dogs to bring the princess and the king to him. He asked the king if he desired to be king again, to which the king replied that all he desired were white flowers in his garden and a happy daughter. Hans promised that when he married the princess, the garden would bloom with white flowers, ensuring her happiness. True to his word, Hans married the princess, becoming the new king. They lived joyfully, blessed with 6 children and a vast garden full of blooming white flowers. The old king, content in his final years, resided nearby, surrounded by a garden thriving with white blossoms all year round.